your brain doesn't ask permission before it betrays you. One moment you're making a conscious choice, and the next, you find yourself caught in a pattern you swore you'd break. The cigarette between your fingers, the drink in your hand, the screen glowing in your face at 3 a.m. These aren't just bad habits. They're manifestations of one of the most profound psychological puzzles of human existence: how your own mind can become both your greatest ally and your most formidable adversary. Addiction isn't a moral failing or a simple lack of willpower, despite what society might tell you. It's a complex psychological phenomenon that hijacks the very systems designed to help you survive and thrive. Your brain, evolved over millions of years to seek pleasure and avoid pain, finds itself overwhelmed by modern triggers that exploit ancient pathways. The result is a condition that can make you feel simultaneously in control and completely powerless. Rational, yet utterly irrational. What makes addiction particularly insidious is how it rewrites your psychological landscape without your conscious awareness. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. Instead, it quietly alters your reward pathways, reshapes your decision-making processes, and gradually transforms your relationship with yourself and the world around you. By the time you recognize what's happening, the changes may feel irreversible, though they rarely are. Understanding the psychology of addiction means confronting uncomfortable truths about human nature itself. You'll discover how your brain's most fundamental processes, those governing motivation, memory, and emotion, can be co-opted by substances and behaviors that promise relief but deliver imprisonment. You'll explore why some people seem naturally resilient, while others appear vulnerable from their first encounter with potentially addictive substances or activities. The neurobiology of your addicted brain. To understand addiction's psychological grip, you must first understand how your brain creates the very experience of wanting something. Deep within your neural architecture lies a system so fundamental to survival that it predates human consciousness by millions of years. The mesolimbic dopamine system, your brain's reward pathway, originally evolved to ensure you'd repeat behaviors essential for survival: eating, drinking, reproducing, and forming social bonds. When you encounter something pleasurable, your brain doesn't simply register satisfaction. Instead, it releases dopamine in anticipation of the reward, creating a neurochemical signature that says, "This is important, remember this, do it again." This system worked perfectly for our ancestors, who needed strong motivation to seek out scarce resources in dangerous environments. But your modern brain, unchanged in its basic architecture, now confronts a world filled with artificially concentrated rewards that can overwhelm these ancient circuits. Consider what happens in your brain when you use an addictive substance. Cocaine, for instance, doesn't create new sensations. It hijacks your existing reward system by blocking dopamine reuptake, causing an unnaturally intense flood of this neurotransmitter. Your brain, interpreting this as evidence of an extraordinarily important event, begins to reorganize itself around obtaining and using the substance. Neural pathways strengthen, creating superhighways between triggers and cravings that can persist long after the substance has left your system. This neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to rewire itself, is both addiction's greatest strength and its potential weakness. The same flexibility that allows addiction to take hold also makes recovery possible, though the process requires patience and understanding of how these deep-seated changes occur. Your brain doesn't distinguish between good and bad adaptations. It simply responds to patterns of stimulation and reward. The prefrontal cortex, your brain's executive center responsible for decision-making and impulse control, becomes increasingly compromised in addiction. This region, which normally helps you weigh consequences and make rational choices, shows decreased activity in brain scans of people with addiction. You might find yourself making decisions that seem completely irrational to others, but your altered brain chemistry makes these choices feel not just reasonable but necessary. Tolerance and withdrawal represent your brain's attempt to maintain homeostasis in the face of artificial stimulation. As your neural circuits adapt to the presence of addictive substances, you need increasingly larger amounts to achieve the same effect. When the substance is removed, your brain, now dependent on external stimulation to function normally, rebels with symptoms ranging from mild discomfort to life-threatening withdrawal syndromes. Understanding these neurobiological changes can be both liberating and terrifying. It's liberating because it explains why willpower alone often fails against addiction. You're not fighting against a simple habit, but against fundamental changes in brain structure and function. It's terrifying because it reveals how addiction can alter the very essence of who you are, changing not just what you do, but how you think and feel about yourself and the world. The psychology of craving and compulsion. Your conscious mind experiences addiction as a psychological battle between competing desires and values. On one side stands your rational self, aware of consequences and committed to change. On the other lurks a primitive drive that can overwhelm reason with surprising speed and intensity. This internal conflict creates a unique form of psychological suffering that those who haven't experienced addiction often struggle to understand. Craving represents one of addiction's most psychologically complex phenomena. Unlike simple desire, which you can usually satisfy or dismiss, craving creates a state of psychological urgency that demands immediate attention. Your mind becomes narrowly focused on obtaining and using the substance or engaging in the behavior, while other concerns, relationships, responsibilities, even basic needs, fade into the background. The psychology of craving involves multiple cognitive and emotional processes working in concert. Your brain creates powerful associations between environmental cues and drug use, so that encountering certain people, places, emotions, or situations can trigger intense cravings even years after your last use. These cue-induced cravings can feel like they come from nowhere, catching you off guard when you thought you were over your addiction. Memory plays a crucial role in maintaining addictive patterns. Your brain doesn't just remember the effects of substances, it remembers them selectively, emphasizing positive experiences while minimizing negative consequences. This phenomenon, called euphoric recall, can make past drug use seem more pleasurable than it actually was, while present sobriety feels unnecessarily difficult. The concept of drug dreams illustrates how deeply addiction penetrates your psychological landscape. Even in sleep, your unconscious mind continues processing themes of using, obtaining, and craving substances. These dreams can be so vivid and emotionally charged that you wake up feeling as though you've actually used, sometimes triggering guilt or renewed cravings. Compulsion represents the psychological endpoint of addiction's progression. Unlike craving, which maintains some element of choice, compulsion feels like an external force acting upon you. You may find yourself engaging in addictive behaviors despite having no conscious desire to do so, as if your body is operating independently of your will. This experience can be profoundly disturbing, creating a sense of self-alienation that compounds addiction's other psychological effects. The psychological defense mechanisms surrounding addiction often develop as attempts to preserve self-esteem and maintain functioning. Denial isn't simply lying to others, it's a complex psychological process that allows you to maintain multiple contradictory beliefs simultaneously. You might genuinely believe you can stop any time while also planning your next opportunity to use. Rationalization serves a similar function, providing seemingly logical explanations for behaviors that contradict your values and goals. These mental gymnastics aren't character flaws but psychological adaptations to an impossible situation, maintaining self-respect while engaging in self-destructive behavior. Emotional regulation and psychological vulnerability. Your emotional landscape plays a crucial role in both developing and maintaining addiction. For many people, substances or addictive behaviors serve as emotional regulation tools, providing temporary relief from psychological pain that seems otherwise unbearable. Understanding this relationship requires examining how emotions, trauma, and psychological vulnerabilities create the perfect storm for addictive behaviors. Trauma represents one of the most significant risk factors for developing addiction. Childhood abuse, neglect, or witnessing violence can fundamentally alter your stress response system, leaving you hypervigilant and emotionally dysregulated. When you encounter substances that provide temporary relief from this chronic psychological discomfort, they can feel like medicine rather than recreation. The concept of self-medication suggests that many addictive behaviors begin as attempts to treat untreated psychological conditions. If you suffer from anxiety, depression, PTSD, or other mental health issues, substances might initially provide the relief that proper treatment could offer. However, this relief comes at a cost. The temporary improvement in symptoms masks the underlying condition while creating new problems. Emotional numbing represents another common psychological function of addiction. Some people use substances not to feel better, but to feel less, to escape overwhelming emotions or traumatic memories. This emotional anesthesia can become so central to functioning that sobriety feels impossibly raw and vulnerable. The relationship between mood and addiction creates complex feedback loops. Depression can drive substance use, which can worsen depression, which can increase substance use, and so on. Breaking these cycles often requires addressing both the addiction and the underlying emotional issues simultaneously. Shame plays a particularly destructive role in addiction psychology. Unlike guilt, which focuses on behavior, I did something bad, shame attacks identity, I am bad. Addiction generates shame through its impact on behavior, relationships, and self-perception. This shame then drives further substance use as a way to escape the painful self-awareness, creating a vicious cycle that can be difficult to break. Your attachment style, developed in early childhood relationships, also influences addiction vulnerability. People with insecure attachment patterns may be more likely to seek comfort in substances rather than relationships, particularly if their early experiences taught them that people are unreliable sources of support. Emotional intelligence, your ability to recognize, understand, and manage emotions, serves as a protective factor against addiction. When you can identify emotional triggers, understand their origins, and develop healthy coping strategies, you're less likely to rely on substances for emotional regulation. The concept of emotional sobriety extends beyond simply not using substances to encompass developing mature emotional responses to life's challenges. This involves learning to tolerate uncomfortable emotions without immediately seeking relief, developing healthy relationships that provide genuine support, and finding meaning and purpose that transcends immediate gratification. Cognitive distortions and thinking patterns. Your thinking patterns in addiction don't just reflect poor decision-making. They represent systematic distortions in how you process information, evaluate risks, and make predictions about the future. These cognitive changes can be so subtle that you don't recognize them occurring, yet they profoundly influence your behavior and choices. All-or-nothing thinking represents one of the most common cognitive distortions in addiction. You might view yourself as either completely sober or completely out of control with no middle ground. This black and white perspective can make small slip-ups feel like total failures, potentially triggering full-blown relapses when more nuanced thinking might have prevented them. Catastrophic thinking amplifies the psychological impact of negative events, making temporary setbacks feel like permanent disasters. When you're in active addiction, losing a job might feel like proof that you're fundamentally worthless, rather than a consequence of specific behaviors that can be changed. Minimization works in the opposite direction, downplaying the severity of addiction's consequences. You might acknowledge that your drinking causes problems while simultaneously dismissing these problems as minor or temporary. This cognitive bias helps maintain addiction by preventing the accumulation of evidence that might motivate change. The planning fallacy affects how you think about future behavior. You consistently overestimate your ability to resist temptation tomorrow, while underestimating the power of immediate impulses today. This leads to making commitments you can't keep and setting yourself up for repeated disappointments. Probability distortion changes how you evaluate risks and rewards. The immediate certain pleasure of substance use becomes weighted more heavily than the delayed, uncertain consequences of continued use. Your brain essentially develops a form of temporal myopia, making it difficult to see beyond immediate gratification. Selective attention and confirmation bias further distort your perception of reality. You notice information that supports continued use while ignoring evidence of problems. If you're trying to quit, you might focus on stories of people who failed to maintain sobriety, while dismissing examples of successful recovery. The concept of terminal uniqueness represents a particularly insidious cognitive distortion, where you believe your situation is so unique that conventional wisdom doesn't apply. This thinking can prevent you from seeking help or following treatment recommendations, as you convince yourself that your addiction is fundamentally different from others. Cognitive dissonance creates psychological discomfort when your behavior contradicts your values or self-image. Rather than changing behavior to match values, you might change your values or self-image to match behavior. Someone who sees themselves as a good parent might redefine what constitutes good parenting to accommodate their substance use. These thinking patterns aren't random. They serve psychological functions that help maintain addiction, while preserving some sense of self-worth and control. Recognizing these distortions represents a crucial step in recovery, as it allows you to question automatic thoughts and develop more balanced perspectives. The social psychology of addiction. Your addiction doesn't exist in isolation. It emerges from and is sustained by complex social and environmental factors that shape both your vulnerability to addiction and your ability to recover. Understanding these social dimensions reveals how addiction is as much a social phenomenon as it is an individual psychological condition. Social learning theory explains how you acquire many of the behaviors, attitudes, and expectations surrounding substance use. Long before you ever try drugs or alcohol, you observe others using these substances, noting their effects and the social context in which they're consumed. These observations create mental models that influence your own behavior when you encounter similar situations. Peer influence operates through multiple mechanisms beyond simple pressure. Your friends and social group provide implicit permission for certain behaviors, normalize specific levels of consumption, and create environments where substance use feels natural and expected. Even without explicit encouragement, simply being around others who use substances regularly can gradually shift your own usage patterns. Social identity plays a crucial role in both developing and maintaining addiction. If substance use becomes central to your sense of self or your group membership, giving it up can feel like losing part of your identity. This is particularly true for people whose social lives revolve around bars, parties, or other environments where substance use is the primary social activity. The concept of drinking buddies, or using partners, illustrates how relationships can become structured around substance use. These relationships often lack the depth and authenticity of genuine friendships, but they provide predictable companionship for addictive behaviors. Losing these relationships in recovery can leave you feeling isolated and questioning whether sobriety is worth the social cost. Social stigma surrounding addiction creates additional psychological burdens that can actually worsen the condition. When society views addiction as a moral failing rather than a health condition, you might internalize this judgment, leading to shame and self-hatred that drive further substance use. The fear of judgment can also prevent you from seeking help until your situation becomes desperate. Family dynamics significantly influence both addiction development and recovery outcomes. Dysfunctional family patterns, such as enabling behaviors or cycles of conflict and reconciliation, can perpetuate addictive behaviors. Conversely, families that provide consistent support while maintaining healthy boundaries often facilitate better recovery outcomes. The economic psychology of addiction reveals how financial factors influence behavior in ways that pure economic theory doesn't predict. You might spend your last dollar on drugs while skipping meals, or choose immediate gratification over long-term financial security. These choices reflect addiction's impact on decision-making rather than simple financial irresponsibility. Social support networks serve as crucial protective factors against addiction. Having people who provide emotional support, practical assistance, and accountability can significantly improve your chances of recovery. However, building these networks often requires skills that addiction may have undermined: trust, reciprocity, and emotional availability. Cultural factors influence both the prevalence and expression of addiction. Different cultures have varying attitudes towards substance use, different available substances, and different social structures that either support or discourage addictive behaviors. Understanding your cultural context helps explain why certain forms of addiction are more common in some communities than others. Trauma and its psychological legacy. The relationship between trauma and addiction represents one of the most significant areas of psychological research and clinical practice. If you've experienced trauma, your risk of developing addiction increases dramatically. But understanding this connection can provide valuable insights into both the origins of your addiction and pathways to recovery. Trauma fundamentally alters your nervous system's response to stress. Your brain learns to exist in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats and preparing for danger. This chronic activation of stress response systems can be exhausting and overwhelming, making substances that provide temporary relief feel like necessary medicine rather than recreational choices. The concept of trauma reenactment suggests that addictive behaviors sometimes represent unconscious attempts to recreate or master traumatic experiences. This might seem counterintuitive. Why would you want to recreate trauma? But the psychological drive to transform passive victimization into active choice can be powerful. even when the choices are ultimately self-destructive. Childhood trauma creates particularly profound effects because it occurs during critical periods of brain development. If you experienced abuse, neglect, or other traumatic events during childhood, your brain adapted to survive in a dangerous environment. These adaptations, while protective in the original context, can create vulnerabilities to addiction in adulthood. Complex trauma, resulting from repeated exposure to traumatic events, can fragment your sense of self and create what psychologists call structural dissociation. This can leave you feeling like different parts of yourself are in conflict, one part wanting to stay sober while another compulsively seeks substances. Understanding this internal fragmentation can be crucial for recovery. The window of tolerance represents your nervous system's capacity to handle stress without becoming overwhelmed. Trauma can narrow this window, making you more sensitive to stress and more likely to use substances to regulate your emotional state. Expanding your window of tolerance through therapy and other healing practices can reduce your reliance on substances for emotional regulation. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and addiction frequently co-occur, creating what clinicians call dual diagnosis or co-occurring disorders. The symptoms of PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, emotional numbing can drive substance use, while substance use can worsen PTSD symptoms. This creates a complex clinical picture that requires specialized treatment approaches. Intergenerational trauma suggests that traumatic experiences can be passed down through families, affecting people who didn't directly experience the original trauma. This transmission can occur through parenting styles, family dynamics, and even epigenetic changes that influence gene expression. Understanding your family's trauma history can provide insights into your own psychological vulnerabilities. The concept of post-traumatic growth offers hope for people dealing with both trauma and addiction. While trauma can create vulnerabilities, it can also catalyze profound personal growth and transformation. Many people find that addressing their trauma becomes a pathway, not just to sobriety, but to a more authentic and fulfilling life. Trauma-informed addiction treatment recognizes the central role of trauma in many people's addiction stories. This approach emphasizes safety, trustworthiness, peer support, and empowerment rather than confrontation and breaking down defenses. Understanding whether your addiction treatment provider uses trauma-informed approaches can significantly impact your recovery experience. Identity and self-concept in addiction. Your sense of self undergoes profound changes during the development and progression of addiction. What begins as external behavior gradually becomes internalized as identity, fundamentally altering how you see yourself and your place in the world. This transformation of self-concept represents one of addiction's most psychologically complex aspects. In early stages of addiction, you might maintain a clear distinction between who you are and what you do. You see yourself as a person who occasionally drinks too much or uses drugs, not as an alcoholic or addict. This psychological distance allows you to maintain a positive self-image while engaging in increasingly problematic behaviors. As addiction progresses, these behaviors become more central to your daily life and self-perception. You might find yourself thinking of yourself as a drinker, or organizing your identity around your substance use. This shift from behavior to identity represents a crucial psychological threshold. Once addiction becomes who you are rather than what you do, change becomes much more challenging. The concept of spoiled identity explains how addiction can contaminate your entire self-concept. Rather than seeing yourself as a complex person who happens to have an addiction, you might begin to view yourself primarily through the lens of your addiction. This can lead to a form of identity foreclosure where you stop developing other aspects of yourself. Shame and self-worth become intimately connected in addiction. Repeated failures to control your behavior, broken promises to yourself and others, and the accumulation of negative consequences can create a deep sense of personal inadequacy. This shame often becomes self-perpetuating as you use substances to escape the painful awareness of your perceived failures. The false self represents a psychological adaptation to the contradiction between your values and your behavior. You might develop a public persona that hides your addiction, while privately struggling with feelings of inauthenticity and disconnection. This splitting of self can be exhausting and isolating, creating additional psychological pressure. Recovery often requires not just stopping substance use, but reconstructing your entire sense of self. This process can be terrifying because it involves letting go of familiar patterns and identities, even when they're destructive. The question, "Who am I without my addiction?" can feel impossible to answer. Identity foreclosure in addiction means that you might stop developing new interests, skills, or relationships that aren't related to substance use. Your world becomes smaller and more constrained, leaving you with fewer resources for building a fulfilling sober life. Recovery often involves rediscovering or developing aspects of yourself that have been dormant or suppressed. The concept of recovery identity represents the gradual development of a new sense of self that incorporates your experience with addiction while not being defined by it. This might mean identifying as someone in recovery, or simply as someone who has faced significant challenges and grown from them. Values clarification becomes crucial for reconstructing identity in recovery. What do you actually care about when you're not under the influence of substances? What kind of person do you want to be? These questions can be difficult to answer because addiction often involves compromising your values so repeatedly that you lose touch with what they are. The relationship between past, present, and future selves becomes complex in addiction and recovery. You might feel trapped by your past behavior while struggling to envision a different future. Learning to maintain continuity of self while allowing for growth and change represents a key psychological task in recovery. Motivation and the stages of change. Your relationship with motivation in the context of addiction is likely more complex than you realize. Motivation isn't a simple switch that turns on and off. It's a dynamic psychological process that fluctuates over time and can be influenced by various internal and external factors. Understanding how motivation works in addiction and recovery can help you work with your natural psychological processes rather than against them. The trans-theoretical model, also known as the stages of change, provides a framework for understanding how people move through different phases of behavior change. In the pre-contemplation stage, you might not even recognize that your substance use is problematic. External pressure to change often meets with resistance during this stage because the motivation for change hasn't yet developed internally. Contemplation represents the stage where you begin to recognize problems and consider the possibility of change. However, this stage can be characterized by ambivalence. You simultaneously want to change and want to continue using. This internal conflict is normal and represents progress, even though it might feel like indecision or weakness. The preparation stage involves developing specific plans for change and making small behavioral modifications. You might start researching treatment options, reducing your substance use, or telling trusted friends about your intentions. This stage requires balancing optimism about change with realistic planning for the challenges ahead. Action involves implementing significant behavioral changes, such as entering treatment, joining support groups, or making major lifestyle modifications. This stage often receives the most attention and praise, but it's important to remember that action is just one part of the change process. Maintenance involves sustaining the changes you've made and preventing relapse. This stage can be psychologically challenging because the initial excitement of change may fade while the daily work of maintaining sobriety continues. Understanding that maintenance is an active process rather than a passive state can help you stay engaged with your recovery. Relapse is often included as a stage in the change process, recognizing that setbacks are common and don't represent failure. Understanding relapse as part of the process rather than evidence of personal weakness can help you learn from these experiences and strengthen your recovery. Motivational interviewing techniques recognize that motivation is something that develops from within rather than being imposed from outside. Exploring your own reasons for change, examining the discrepancies between your current behavior and your values, and building confidence in your ability to change can be more effective than external pressure or confrontation. The concept of change talk versus sustain talk illustrates how your language reflects your internal motivation. When you find yourself making statements about wanting to change, recognizing problems, or expressing optimism about your ability to change, you're engaging in change talk. Sustain talk, on the other hand, involves statements about why change is difficult or unnecessary. Intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation plays a crucial role in recovery outcomes. Intrinsic motivation comes from internal values and personal satisfaction, while extrinsic motivation comes from external rewards or punishments. Research suggests that intrinsic motivation is more sustainable over time, though extrinsic factors can be important in getting the change process started. The decisional balance involves weighing the pros and cons of changing versus staying the same. Early in the change process, you might see more advantages to continuing your current behavior. As problems accumulate and your values become clearer, the balance shifts toward change. Understanding where you are in this process can help you work with your natural psychological tendencies. Self-efficacy, your belief in your ability to successfully change, represents a crucial component of motivation. Past failures can undermine self-efficacy, while small successes can build confidence. Focusing on developing skills and celebrating small victories can help build the confidence necessary for sustained change. Relapse and the cycle of recovery. Relapse represents one of the most psychologically complex aspects of addiction recovery. Rather than simply representing failure or lack of willpower, relapse reflects the chronic nature of addiction and the challenges of maintaining behavioral change in the face of persistent neurobiological and psychological factors. Understanding the psychology of relapse can help you develop more effective prevention strategies and respond more constructively when setbacks occur. The relapse process typically begins long before you actually use substances again. Emotional relapse involves changes in mood, stress levels, and thinking patterns that increase vulnerability to substance use. You might notice increased irritability, anxiety, or depression, or find yourself reminiscing about past substance use. Recognizing these early warning signs can help you intervene before the relapse process progresses. Mental relapse represents the stage where you begin actively considering substance use. This might involve planning when and where you might use, romanticizing past experiences with substances, or testing your resolve in high-risk situations. The internal battle between wanting to stay sober and wanting to use can be exhausting and emotionally draining. Physical relapse occurs when you actually use substances again. However, understanding relapse as a process rather than an event can help you recognize that you have multiple opportunities to interrupt the progression toward physical relapse. Each stage offers different intervention strategies and opportunities for self-correction. The concept of apparently irrelevant decisions illustrates how relapse can seem to happen suddenly while actually being the result of a series of seemingly innocent choices. Deciding to drive past your old dealer's house, keeping alcohol in your home for guests, or socializing with people who use substances might not seem directly related to relapse, but they create conditions that increase your vulnerability. Relapse triggers can be external, people, places, things, or internal, emotions, thoughts, physical sensations. External triggers are often easier to identify and avoid, while internal triggers require developing skills for managing emotions and thoughts without using substances. Understanding your personal trigger profile can help you develop targeted prevention strategies. The abstinence violation effect describes the psychological phenomenon where a small slip escalates into a full relapse. When you violate your commitment to abstinence, you might experience intense guilt, shame, and self-criticism. Rather than minimizing the slip and recommitting to sobriety, you might think, "I've already blown it, so I might as well keep using." This all-or-nothing thinking can transform a minor setback into a major relapse. Cognitive factors play a crucial role in relapse vulnerability. Overconfidence in your ability to handle high-risk situations, romanticism about past substance use, and expectations about the effects of substances can all increase relapse risk. Developing realistic expectations and maintaining appropriate caution can help prevent these cognitive traps. The role of stress in relapse cannot be overstated. Major life events, relationship conflicts, financial problems, and other stresses can overwhelm your coping resources and make substances seem like the only viable solution. Developing a diverse toolkit of stress management strategies can help you navigate difficult periods without relapsing. Social factors significantly influence relapse risk. Lack of social support, pressure from using friends, or social isolation can all increase vulnerability. Conversely, strong social support networks and meaningful relationships can provide motivation and accountability that help prevent relapse. The concept of recovery capital encompasses the internal and external resources you can draw upon to maintain sobriety. Internal resources include motivation, coping skills, and psychological resilience, while external resources include social support, stable housing, and meaningful activities. Building recovery capital can help you weather the challenges that might otherwise lead to relapse. Learning from relapse can be one of the most valuable aspects of the recovery process. Each relapse provides information about your triggers, vulnerabilities, and the effectiveness of your coping strategies. Rather than viewing relapse as evidence of personal failure, you can use these experiences to refine your recovery plan and strengthen your commitment to sobriety. Treatment approaches and psychological interventions. The landscape of addiction treatment has evolved dramatically over the past several decades, incorporating insights from neuroscience, psychology, and social sciences to develop increasingly sophisticated approaches to recovery. Understanding the psychological principles underlying different treatment modalities can help you make informed decisions about your recovery journey and maximize the effectiveness of your treatment experience. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, represents one of the most extensively researched and effective approaches to addiction treatment. CBT is based on the premise that changing your thoughts and behaviors can lead to changes in emotions and overall psychological well-being. In the context of addiction, CBT helps you identify and modify the thinking patterns and behaviors that contribute to substance use. The cognitive component of CBT focuses on identifying and challenging distorted thinking patterns that contribute to addiction. You learn to recognize automatic thoughts that lead to substance use, examine the evidence for and against these thoughts, and develop more balanced and realistic perspectives. This process helps you develop greater awareness of your internal experience and more control over your responses to triggers and cravings. Behavioral interventions in CBT include developing coping strategies for managing cravings, avoiding high-risk situations, and building healthy lifestyle habits. You might learn relaxation techniques, problem-solving skills, and communication strategies that help you navigate challenges without resorting to substance use. The emphasis on practical skills makes CBT particularly appealing to people who prefer concrete, action-oriented approaches to recovery. Motivational interviewing, MI, takes a different approach, focusing on enhancing your intrinsic motivation for change rather than directly challenging your defenses or providing advice. MI recognizes that ambivalence about change is normal and that your own reasons for change are more powerful than external pressure. Through empathetic listening and strategic questioning, MI helps you explore your own motivations and build confidence in your ability to change. The principles of MI include expressing empathy, developing discrepancy between current behavior and personal values, rolling with resistance rather than confronting it directly, and supporting self-efficacy. This approach can be particularly helpful if you've felt judged or criticized in previous treatment attempts, as it emphasizes collaboration and respect for your autonomy. Dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, was originally developed for borderline personality disorder, but has proven effective for addiction, particularly when co-occurring with emotional regulation difficulties. DBT focuses on building 4 core skills: mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. These skills can be particularly valuable for people who use substances to manage intense emotions or relationship conflicts. Acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, emphasizes psychological flexibility, the ability to stay present with your experiences, including difficult thoughts and emotions, while acting in accordance with your values. Rather than trying to eliminate cravings or negative emotions, ACT teaches you to accept these experiences as part of life, while choosing behaviors that align with what truly matters to you. Mindfulness-based interventions have gained significant attention in addiction treatment, drawing from Buddhist meditation practices adapted for secular therapeutic contexts. Mindfulness-based relapse prevention, MBRP, teaches you to observe thoughts, emotions, and sensations without immediately reacting to them. This creates space between trigger and response, allowing you to choose your actions rather than being driven by automatic reactions. The practice of mindfulness in addiction recovery involves developing what psychologists call urge surfing, the ability to ride out cravings and uncomfortable emotions without acting on them. Like ocean waves, cravings have a natural rise and fall pattern. By learning to observe this process without judgment, you can develop confidence in your ability to tolerate discomfort without using substances. Family therapy approaches recognize that addiction affects entire family systems, not just individuals. These interventions help family members understand addiction as a disease rather than a moral failing, develop healthy boundaries, and create environments that support recovery rather than enabling continued substance use. Family therapy can be particularly important when addiction has damaged relationships that are crucial for long-term recovery support. The role of spirituality and meaning-making. Your search for meaning and purpose plays a crucial role in both the development of addiction and the recovery process. Many people discover that their substance use represents, at least partially, an attempt to fill a spiritual or existential void, a deep sense that life lacks meaning or purpose. Understanding this dimension of addiction can open up powerful avenues for healing and growth. Existential psychology suggests that humans have fundamental needs for meaning, purpose, and connection that go beyond basic survival. When these needs aren't met through healthy relationships, meaningful work, or spiritual practices, you might turn to substances as a way to temporarily escape the anxiety and emptiness that can accompany an unfulfilled life. The concept of spiritual bypassing describes how some people use spiritual practices or beliefs to avoid dealing with psychological or emotional issues. In the context of addiction, this might involve using meditation, prayer, or spiritual concepts as substitutes for practical recovery work or psychological healing. While spirituality can be profoundly helpful in recovery, it works best when integrated with other approaches rather than used in isolation. Many people find that addiction strips away their sense of connection to something greater than themselves. This spiritual disconnection can manifest as cynicism, hopelessness, or a profound sense of isolation. Recovery often involves rebuilding this sense of connection, whether through traditional religious practices, nature-based spirituality, or secular approaches to finding meaning and purpose. The concept of surrender plays a crucial role in many spiritual approaches to addiction recovery. This doesn't mean passive resignation, but rather an active acceptance of your limitations and a willingness to seek help from sources beyond your individual will. This surrender can be directed toward a traditional concept of God, toward the wisdom of a recovery community, or toward the natural processes of healing and growth. Forgiveness, both of yourself and others, represents another crucial spiritual dimension of recovery. Addiction often involves actions that violate your values and harm people you care about. Learning to forgive yourself for past mistakes while taking responsibility for making amends can be essential for psychological healing and maintaining sobriety. Service to others emerges as a common theme in many recovery stories. Having experienced the depths of addiction and the possibility of recovery, many people find deep satisfaction in helping others who are struggling with similar issues. This service can provide a sense of purpose and meaning that helps sustain long-term recovery. The development of wisdom through suffering represents a potential gift of the addiction experience. While no one would choose addiction as a path to personal growth, many people find that their struggle with addiction ultimately leads to greater self-awareness, compassion, and understanding of the human condition. This transformation of suffering into wisdom can provide meaning that makes the difficult journey worthwhile. The future of addiction, psychology and recovery. The field of addiction psychology continues to evolve rapidly, incorporating new insights from neuroscience, genetics, and digital health technologies. Understanding these emerging trends can help you stay informed about new treatment options and recovery strategies that might become available. personalized medicine approaches are beginning to incorporate genetic testing to identify individuals who might be more vulnerable to specific types of addiction or who might respond better to certain treatment approaches. While still in early stages, this research suggests that your genetic makeup influences not only your addiction risk, but also which treatments are most likely to be effective for you. Digital therapeutics represent a growing field that uses smartphone apps, virtual reality, and other technologies to deliver evidence-based interventions. These tools can provide 24/7 support, track your recovery progress, and deliver interventions at the moment when you need them most. While technology cannot replace human connection and professional treatment, it can serve as a valuable supplement to traditional approaches. Psychedelic-assisted therapy is experiencing renewed scientific interest, with studies suggesting that substances like psilocybin, MDMA, and ketamine might be helpful for treating addiction when used in controlled therapeutic settings. These approaches often involve intensive psychological preparation and integration work. Integration and hope. Your journey through the psychology of addiction reveals a landscape of extraordinary complexity, where neurobiological vulnerabilities intersect with psychological patterns, social influences, and individual circumstances to create unique challenges and opportunities for each person. Understanding addiction through this multifaceted lens helps explain why simple solutions rarely work, and why recovery often requires comprehensive, individualized approaches. The psychological principles underlying addiction, reward system dysfunction, cognitive distortions, emotional dysregulation, and identity changes also point toward pathways for healing and growth. Your brain's neuroplasticity, which allows addiction to take hold, also makes recovery possible. The same psychological flexibility that can trap you in addictive patterns can be redirected toward building a fulfilling, meaningful life in recovery. Perhaps most importantly, understanding the psychology of addiction can help reduce the shame and self-blame that often accompany these conditions. Addiction is not a moral failing or a lack of willpower. It's a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors that can affect anyone. This understanding can free you from the burden of self-judgment and allow you to focus your energy on the practical work of recovery. Recovery is not simply the absence of addiction. It's the presence of connection, meaning, purpose, and psychological well-being. The journey toward recovery offers opportunities for profound personal growth, deeper relationships, and a more authentic way of living. While the path is rarely easy, understanding the psychological terrain you're navigating can help you make informed decisions about your recovery journey and maintain hope even during difficult periods. Your story with addiction does not define you, but it can inform and enrich your understanding of yourself and your capacity for resilience, growth, and transformation. The insights gained through struggling with and recovering from addiction often become sources of wisdom, compassion, and strength that serve you well beyond the realm of substance use. In understanding the psychology of addiction, you gain not only tools for recovery, but also deeper insight into the beautiful, complex, and ultimately hopeful nature of human psychology itself. The psychology of addiction. Understanding your mind's complex relationship with dependence